The United States just attacked Iran. Within hours, the entire Middle East was on edge. Oil prices jumped, stock markets dropped, and ships started avoiding the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow passage carries nearly 1/5 of the world's oil every day. None of this is surprising. That's usually what happens when tensions explode in the Middle East. But while everyone was watching the missiles, I kept thinking about something else: America's debt. Right now, the United States owes more than $38 trillion. $38 trillion. It's the largest national debt in human history. And here's the strange part. The U.S. government now spends hundreds of billions of dollars every year just paying interest on that debt. In other words, before the government builds roads, before it funds schools, before it does almost anything else, it has to pay the interest. So when I first saw the news about the strike on Iran, one question immediately came to mind. Why would a country with that much debt risk another major war? Because wars are unbelievably expensive. The Iraq War cost more than $2 trillion. The war in Afghanistan cost even more. So if America already owes $38 trillion, why step into another conflict that could cost hundreds of billions more? Of course, the explanations came quickly. Some say this is about Iran's nuclear program. Others say it's about protecting global oil routes. And maybe that's part of the story, but the more I looked into it, the more it felt like something was missing. Because when you start connecting oil, debt, and global crises, a very different pattern begins to appear. So I decided to start with the most obvious explanation first. Is this really about nuclear weapons? So the first explanation you hear everywhere is simple. This war is about nuclear weapons. Iran has been developing its nuclear program for a long time. More than 20 years. Centrifuges, enrichment facilities, sanctions, negotiations. The story has been repeating for decades, and the argument usually sounds like this. If Iran gets a nuclear weapon, the balance of power in the Middle East could change overnight. That's why some officials say the United States had to act before Iran crossed that line. In fact, this warning has been repeated for years. Former U.S. defense officials have said many times that a nuclear Iran would be unacceptable. So at first glance, the explanation sounds reasonable. But when you step back and look at the timeline, something feels off. Because Iran's nuclear program didn't start last year or 5 years ago. It has existed for more than 2 decades. Negotiations have happened, sanctions have happened, threats have happened again and again, which leads to a very simple question. Why now? Why launch a major military strike at this exact moment? Because attacking Iran isn't a small decision. Iran has one of the largest militaries in the Middle East. And if a conflict there spirals out of control, the consequences could be enormous. Oil markets could explode. Shipping routes could collapse. Entire regions could be pulled into the war. In other words, the risks are massive. And when the risks are that large, countries usually act only when they absolutely have to. But if Iran's nuclear program has existed for more than 20 years, then this conflict might not be only about nuclear weapons. It might be connected to something larger, something that affects the entire global economy. Because when tensions rise around Iran, there's one place the entire world starts watching: the Strait of Hormuz. And that's where the story gets interesting. So if nuclear weapons don't fully explain this, the next explanation shows up almost immediately. Oil, more specifically, the Strait of Hormuz. If you look at a map, this place is surprisingly small. At its narrowest point, it's only about 30 miles wide. That's not very big. And yet, every day, a huge amount of the world's energy passes through this one narrow channel. Tankers move through it almost constantly. Oil from Saudi Arabia, oil from Iraq, oil from Kuwait, oil from the United Arab Emirates, all of it squeezing through the same narrow waterway. According to U.S. energy data, roughly 1/5 of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, which means something interesting. If tension rises around this area, oil markets react almost instantly. Sometimes it doesn't even take an actual blockade. Just the fear of disruption can push prices higher. That's why analysts often say something like this: the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most sensitive energy choke points on Earth. So at first glance, the explanation sounds logical. Maybe the United States is trying to protect global oil routes. After all, the modern economy runs on energy. If that flow is interrupted, The entire system can feel the shock. But then I noticed another detail, something that doesn't quite fit. Because the United States today is not just a country that uses oil. It's also one of the countries that produces the most oil in the world. In fact, over the past decade, America has quietly become the largest oil producer on Earth, which creates a strange situation. When oil prices rise, many countries struggle, energy becomes expensive, inflation rises, growth slows down. But for American oil producers, higher prices can actually mean higher profits. And that raises another question. If rising oil prices hurt much of the world, but don't necessarily hurt the United States in the same way, then who actually feels the pressure first? Because when energy prices surge, some economies start cracking much faster than others. And that's when something else started to stand out to me. Because when you look at where Iran sits on the map, it's not just next to major oil routes. It sits right in the middle of something much bigger, right between Russia, right next to China's energy supply lines, and right beside one of the most important energy choke points on Earth, which makes the whole situation feel different. Because maybe Iran isn't just important because of oil. Maybe it's important because of where it sits on the global chessboard. And that raises another question. What role does Iran actually play in the global power balance? And to understand that, we need to look at where Iran sits in the geopolitical map of the world. So then another possibility started to come to mind. Maybe this war isn't really about nuclear weapons. Maybe it isn't just about oil either. Maybe Iran matters because of who it connects to. When you look at the map, Iran sits right next to some very important players. To the north, Russia. To the east, China's enormous appetite for energy. And to the south, the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most sensitive oil choke points on Earth. So at first glance, a theory starts to appear. Maybe the United States is trying to pressure two rivals at the same time, Russia and China. That idea isn't completely unreasonable. Over the last few years, Iran and Russia have grown much closer. Russian President Vladimir Putin has openly called Iran an important partner in resisting Western pressure. At the same time, China has quietly become one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has repeatedly emphasized the need to secure stable energy supplies for China's economy. And here's a detail that caught my attention. A large share of the oil that fuels China's economy travels through waters very close to Iran, which means whenever tension rises here, people in Beijing are watching very carefully. Energy analysts often point this out. They say the Strait of Hormuz is one of the few places where regional conflict could turn into a global shock very quickly. So when you put all of this together, the theory almost sounds reasonable. Maybe this is about weakening Russia. Maybe it's about putting pressure on China's energy supply. But the more I thought about that idea, the less convincing it felt. Because if the real goal were to weaken Russia and China, starting a war in this region would be an extremely dangerous way to do it. If the conflict spreads, Russia could get involved, China could get involved, and once major powers start entering a war, things can escalate very quickly. History has shown that again and again. Wars between great powers are incredibly expensive. They destroy cities, they cost huge amounts of money, and they cost lives, lots of lives. So if the United States only wanted to pressure Russia and China, triggering a conflict that might pull them into a wider war would be an enormous gamble. And a gamble like that would be very hard to control, which makes this explanation feel incomplete too, because the risks would be massive and the costs could be far higher than the benefit. So once again, we're left with the same uncomfortable feeling. The obvious explanations still don't quite work. Not nuclear weapons, not just oil, not even just geopolitics. And that leads to a different question. What if this war isn't really about who America wants to weaken? What if it's about something America wants to trigger? So if the obvious explanations don't fully work, then another possibility starts to appear. What if Iran isn't actually the main target? What if Iran is simply the place where something bigger gets triggered? Because when the United States strikes Iran, Iran responds. Tension rises across the region, and almost immediately, something very predictable begins to happen. Oil markets react. Suddenly, everyone starts talking about one place, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow stretch of water carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply. Every single day, millions of barrels of oil pass through that corridor. Tankers, shipping lanes, energy flows that power entire economies, which means even the possibility of disruption can shake global markets. Energy traders watch this area constantly. Some analysts even describe Hormuz as the most dangerous energy choke point in the world. One shipping analyst once put it this way: if Hormuz is disrupted, the entire global economy feels it almost immediately. And history shows how sensitive this place really is. Sometimes it doesn't even take a real blockade. Just the fear of disruption can send oil prices jumping within hours, which means when conflict appears in this region, oil prices almost always react. And when oil surges, the effects don't stay in the Middle East. Countries that rely heavily on imported energy start feeling the pressure first. Costs rise, factories slow down, entire economies begin to struggle. And if that pressure spreads far enough, it can push the global economy towards something much more serious: a slowdown, or even a recession, which leads to a much bigger question. If the United States understands exactly how sensitive this system is, why would it risk triggering a shock like that in the first place? What could possibly be worth setting that chain reaction in motion? So, if tension around Iran pushes oil higher, then the next question becomes obvious. Why does that matter so much? Because oil is not just another commodity. Oil sits underneath almost everything in the global economy. Ships run on it. Factories run on it. Food production depends on it. Almost every supply chain in the world touches it in some way, which means when oil suddenly becomes expensive, pressure spreads everywhere. Transport becomes more expensive. Manufacturing becomes more expensive. Food prices begin rising, and entire economies start feeling the strain. History has shown how powerful this effect can be. During the oil crisis of the 1970s, global oil prices quadrupled in just a few months. Inflation exploded across many countries. Growth stalled. Several major economies slipped into recession. Then something similar happened again decades later. In 2008, oil prices surged to almost $150 per barrel. Only months later, the global financial system began breaking apart. Banks collapsed, markets crashed, and the world entered the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Energy traders understand this pattern very well. One oil trader once described it like this: when oil jumps too fast, the entire system starts tightening. And that idea stayed with me, because when oil surges suddenly, the weakest economies usually feel it first. Countries that depend heavily on imported energy get squeezed. Their costs rise. Their industries slow down. Their governments begin struggling. And when enough countries start weakening at the same time, something else begins to happen. Large investors start getting nervous. Investment funds begin selling risky assets, stocks, real estate, businesses in unstable economies. Banks become cautious. Big financial institutions start pulling their money out. And when fear spreads across the world like that, those investors begin looking for somewhere safer to move their money. And, historically, there is one place they often run to: the United States. They buy American government bonds. They move money into U.S. banks. They shift their investments into American assets, which leads to a very interesting moment, because once huge amounts of global money start moving into the United States, a different question suddenly appears. Where exactly does all that money go once it arrives in America? And what does that mean for a country that already carries $38 trillion of debt? So, when fear spreads across the global economy and large investors begin pulling money out of risky places, something very predictable starts to happen. They look for somewhere safe, somewhere stable, somewhere the system is unlikely to collapse overnight. And for decades, one place has stood above almost every other market: the United States. So investors start moving their money there. Large investment funds, major banks, pension funds managing retirement savings, even foreign governments, they all begin doing the same thing. They start buying the debt issued by the U.S. government. In simple terms, they lend money to America. They buy U.S. government bonds. Warren Buffett once described this kind of moment very simply. He said that during times of fear, investors often rush toward the safest house in the neighborhood, and in the global financial system, that house has often been the United States. So when millions of investors begin doing this at the same time, something powerful happens. The United States suddenly finds it much easier to borrow money because so many people are willing to lend it. Banks buy the bonds. Funds buy the bonds, retirement funds buy the bonds, governments buy the bonds, and the system keeps absorbing more and more of this debt. But at this point, you might be thinking something. Wait a second. If investors around the world are lending even more money to the United States, doesn't that mean the debt is getting even bigger? If America already owes around $38 trillion, and it keeps borrowing more, how could that possibly make the situation better? How could a crisis actually make that enormous debt easier to carry? That question is where the real mechanism of the system begins. But that creates a strange question. If the world keeps lending money to the United States, doesn't that make the debt even bigger? At first glance, it really looks that way. More bonds, more borrowing, more debt. But when looking closer, something else starts happening at the same time. When millions of investors rush to buy U.S. government bonds, the price of those bonds rises, and when the price rises, the interest rate falls. This sounds strange at first, but the logic is simple. Imagine trying to borrow money when nobody trusts you. You might have to offer 10% interest, but imagine the opposite situation. Millions of people line up and say, "Please take my money." Now the borrower doesn't need to offer 10%, maybe 3%, maybe 1%. Sometimes almost zero, and this has already happened many times. During the 2008 financial crisis, investors flooded into U.S. government bonds. Interest rates collapsed. Some U.S. borrowing costs dropped close to 0%. Then something similar happened again during the pandemic. The Federal Reserve pushed interest rates down to almost zero. And this is where things start to change dramatically, because when interest rates fall toward zero, borrowing becomes incredibly cheap. Imagine carrying a massive mortgage, but suddenly the bank says you barely need to pay interest anymore. The loan is still there, but the pressure becomes far smaller. And then something else usually happens during big crises. Central banks begin creating large amounts of money to stabilize the system. Former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke once explained this very openly. He said the central bank has something like a printing press, meaning money can be created when the system is under stress. And history shows how large this can become. After the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve created more than $4 trillion. During the pandemic crisis, over $5 trillion entered the system. And this is where a subtle shift begins. The value of money itself slowly changes. A simple example makes this easier to see. Imagine lending someone $10 20 years ago. Back then, maybe $1 could buy a loaf of bread, so $10 could buy 10 loaves of bread. But 20 years later, bread might cost $3. Now that same $10 only buys 3 loaves of bread. The number is still 10, but its real value is much smaller, and something similar can happen with government debt. The number of the debt stays the same, but if money slowly loses value over time, the real burden of that debt becomes lighter. This pattern appears again and again in economic history. Billionaire investor Ray Dalio once described it very clearly. When governments face massive debt, they usually have only a few choices: raise taxes, default, or allow money to lose value over time. And very often, the third option quietly becomes the easiest. Looking back at past crises, something else also becomes hard to ignore. During the same financial storms, 2 completely different stories seem to unfold. Millions of people lose jobs, businesses collapse, savings disappear, entire markets crash. But at the same time, some investors somehow become even wealthier. The more I looked into past crises, the more that contrast started to stand out. Why does the same financial storm destroy wealth for millions of people, but create enormous opportunities for a much smaller group? The answer often seems to come down to one thing. They understood what was happening earlier than everyone else, and that raises a question that is difficult to ignore. If a chain reaction like the one we just explored ever started unfolding again, if rising oil prices, financial panic, and global recession began feeding into each other, What could someone actually do before the storm arrives? Is there a way not only to stay safe during a financial crisis like that, but possibly even come out of it stronger?